We imagine Viking longships as vessels of discovery. For Viking women, they were floating elves, chained and crammed into the dark, stinking hall among barrels of supplies and stolen goods. There was no escape. There was no moment of peace. Here, the reader's entitlement to their bodies became a daily, grinding reality. The Old Norse word for this was nor. It means need or compulsion, but in practice, it meant the Vikings assumed rights to rape his property whenever and however he wished. On a long voyage, with weeks of open sea ahead, captive women were treated as a communal resource for the crew. They were used to relieve boredom and frustration, to maintain morale among the men. Their assaults were relentless, passed between men who saw them as nothing more than a warm body. The 10th century Arab emissary, Ibn Fadlan, gave a chilling first-hand account of this culture among the Norse Vikings he encountered. He wrote with disgust how a warrior would publicly force himself upon a slave girl in front of his comrades, who would watch on without a second thought. There was no concept of privacy because there was no concept of shame. The act itself was a reaffirmation of their power. The woman wasn't a person, she was an object, an ongoing trauma, a part of the daily routine of the ship. Imagine the psychological torment. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every footsteps on the deck above was a harbinger of another attack. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were surrounded by the men who had butchered their families, forced to endure their touch, their smell, their violence, day after day, night after night. Survival meant dissociating from your own body, becoming a ghost within your own skin. And for those who did survive the journey, their arrival in Scandinavia only meant that their status as sexual property was about to be formalized, recorded, and sold on an open market. The great Viking ports were the hub of a vast slave trade that stretched from Ireland to the Middle East, and it was from here that women who had survived the journey were put on the auction block. This was the final, formal stripping of their humanity. They were washed, sometimes oiled, to look healthier and more appealing. They were lined up on wooden platforms, naked or in rags, while buyers, farmers, chieftains, merchants inspected them like livestock. Their value was debated openly. Was she strong enough for farm work? Was she pretty enough to be a concubine? Had the journey broken her spirit, or was she still defiant? A defiant spirit would be beaten out of her. A mother would be sold to one master, a daughter to another. Their final, desperate pleas ignored. This was business. Once sold, a life became one of permanent servitude. Most became a thrall, the lowest rung of Viking society. A thrall was less than human in the eyes of the law. A life was hard labor from sunup to sundown. But moving into that labor was the unending expectation of sexual service. A body was a common utility for the men of the household. The master, his sons, his guests, any of them could rape her at will without consequence. It wasn't even considered a crime. It was an owner's right. If she bore a child from one of these rapes, the child was born a slave, property of a master. Forced breeding was a deliberate economic strategy. A master could increase his wealth and workforce simply by systematically raping his female thralls. A few might become a thriller, a chieftain's concubine. This was not a promotion, it was a specialization. It meant she was reserved exclusively for the master's bed. Her survival depended entirely on her ability to please him sexually and produce children, preferably sons. But she was still a slave. If she displeased him, she could be beaten, discarded, or sold off. She lived a life of constant jealousy and fear, hated by the master's official wife and seen as a rival by other concubines. Whether a field slave or a bed slave, her purpose was the same, to serve the needs and absorb the violence of her owners. But even this grim existence was a mercy compared to the fate reserved for a select few. For them, sexual violence was just a prelude to a sanctified death. Norse paganism was a brutal fate, demanding blood to appease the gods. When a great chieftain dies, his journey to the afterlife requires a magnificent and terrible sacrifice. Again, we must turn to the horrifyingly specific account of Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Norse chief's funeral. The ritual he describes is the absolute apex of Viking cruelty. Upon the chieftain's death, his crew asked his slave girls, "Who among you will die with him?" One girl was coerced into volunteering. This was the beginning of a 10-day public ritual of sexual torture and psychological breakdown. She was dressed in fine clothes, given intoxicating drinks, and celebrated as a spiritual bride. But this celebration was a waking nightmare. She was taken from tent to tent, where the chief's most trusted lieutenants would each have sex with her, telling her, "Tell your master I've done this out of love for him." This was a ritualized gang rape, framed as a holy duty. Her body was being turned into a sacrificial vessel, a message to be delivered to the world of the dead. Her violation was not just tolerated, it was sacred. On the final day, she was brought to the funeral ship by an old crone the Arabs called the Angel of Death. This priestess was the master of ceremonies for the final act. The girl was forced to drink more potions until she was dazed and barely conscious. Then she was taken into the death tent on the ship. 6 men entered with her and raped her one last time. Immediately after, she was held down. The angel of death looped a corded rope around her neck, giving 2 men to pull. As they strangled her, the old woman took a wide-bladed dagger and repeatedly stabbed her between the ribs until she was dead. This fusion of sexual assault, strangulation, and stabbing was the ritual's climax. Her life was extinguished at the precise moment of ultimate violation. Her body was then laid on the pyre next to her master, a final offering to serve him in death, as she had been forced to serve his men in her final moments of life. This was not an aberration. This was their religion. This is the history that has been sanitized for our consumption. The Vikings were not just raiders. They built an empire and an economy on the foundation of systematic sexual violence. It was their tool of terror, their method of trade, and for some, their most sacred rites. The stories we see on screen are a pale, cloudy shadow of the truth. The real sagas of the Viking age were not written in runes, but in the silent, unrecoverable trauma of countless women whose names we will never know.